Time to take a look at the logistics of the Roman army while on campaign. Supplying the Roman army while it was fighting was a crucial endeavor. However, owing to the scarcity of source material on the subject, actually writing about this is somewhat difficult. In order for soldiers to fight effectively, they need supplies, like food and water, systems of transport to move those supplies, so road systems and perhaps ships, and in the modern day, automobiles, but in the ancient and medieval world, this would have been done by animals, and the military actually needs to get the supplies from somewhere. So, how did the Roman army, arguably one of the best and most successful militaries in history, go about this formidable task? In the early period, so the era of kings and probably the early republic as well, the territory of Rome was not exactly large. Really, it was just the city and the surrounding lands, and they were fighting other cities and other towns and their surrounding lands, all in Italy. So in this period, the fighting was localized, which meant that supply lines did not have to go very far, and in theory, supplies would not really have been an issue. This is reflected in some of the sources for this time period, which tell us that campaigning was conducted during the summer, so in general, less was required because troops could forage, and which tell us that soldiers were often required to actually bring some of their own supplies. With the creation of the Roman Empire, however, there arose a new set of problems. It's one thing to order soldiers to bring supplies with them to last a few weeks in the summer, when those supplies could be supplemented by foraging. It's quite another to provision those troops when fighting the long, protracted conflicts that characterized the late Republic and the Roman Empire in general, like the Punic Wars. Add to this the sheer size of the territory in which the armies had to fight, and the Romans very quickly are presented with major problems. These troops need to be fed, and they need to be fed every day. Equipment breaks, so it needs to be fixed. People get injured in battle, so they need medicine. How do you reliably secure those resources and then move them? Well, we have two answers to these questions, and those answers revolve around the state of the Roman military. The Roman Empire, unlike the majority of Republican history, had a professional standing army. Under Augustus, and those who followed him, the frontiers of the Roman Empire became fairly stabilized, and because of the long-term stability, defensive networks of forts crisscrossed the frontiers. Accompanying these structures was a web of road networks which connected the forts to towns and cities. So, when the empire was actually at peace, there existed permanent bases in which the military was housed. And it is in this state of action, peace, that we actually have the majority of our information on logistics. While garrisoned, and while being deployed within the empire to crush internal rebellions and to enforce order, the military required massive amounts of pottery, food, fuel, metal, water, etc. To supply these while the military was inactive was relatively simple. If the military was near the frontier, we know that treaties were signed with tribes across the frontier zone to supply food and other goods in exchange for Roman products, which is part of what accounts for the gradual increasing complexity of Central European archaeology in the Roman era. Alternatively, the military appears to have grown some food themselves, and local towns also supplied materials. We don't know for certain if there was some kind of central reserve system for supplies. We do know that there was some form of central treasury to pay the troops, but food and other items appear to have been more of a localized matter, conducted on an army-by-army basis. Supplying the army while on campaign presents a different problem, mainly, again, because the sources tell us less than we would actually like. In theory, the military could have a supply line, although how effective that would have been is less than certain. We do know that armies often had to requisition transport units, ships, animals, etc. I suppose theoretically slaves could be used as well, and we know that they requisitioned these by force. It's not that armies did not have these things initially, or they weren't supplied with things like wagons or animals. They were. It's that while on campaign, eventually, wagons break, animals die, maybe they're eaten, war takes its toll. The army also may just have not had enough starting out. The alternative was to forage, plunder, and pillage, and often on campaign the three folded up into one system. The soldiers carried their personal baggage and tools on their person, so in addition to weapons and some clothing, potentially armor as well provided that wasn't on an animal, that meant axes, saws, picks, shovels, and other tools. We don't know how much they actually carried themselves though. Different sources give different estimates. Josephus tells us they carried tools and 3 days' rations and other supplies. Vegetius tells us the pack for a soldier weighed 60 Roman pounds. So there's that, but on the other hand, Marius's troops earned the nickname Marius's mules because their general stripped them down to the bare necessities in order to move his armies quickly. As far as the beasts of burden are concerned, the numbers required was staggering. Estimates of exactly how many animals required vary, with Adrian Goldsworthy figuring somewhere around 650 animals and about 60 wagons would be needed to move a single legion. These animals, oxen, horses, and mules, were required to carry food, both what was required by the military, their own feed, and then more, and cooking supplies used by the centuries, lumber and other resources for constructing bridges and forts, tools, artillery pieces, and general maintenance equipment, which, because the military used weapons and armor made from metal and wood, meant smithing and carpentry supplies. All of this would have weighed down the animals a great deal, which means they would have moved extremely slowly. How slowly isn't really known. Some estimates place the total distance traveled daily at 2 or 3 miles an hour for oxen and their carts, and 5 or 6 miles an hour for other animals. In order to actually ensure that the military did not become overstretched, the soldiers also moved slowly, so by the time the legion's quarters were constructed for the night, the last of the legion would be arriving. There's an associated issue with the pack animals as well. The animals needed to be attended to, and it wasn't the soldiers who did this. Slaves fulfilled this role. However, we don't know if these slaves were part of individual attendants brought along by the officers and general soldiers, or if there was a collective unit of slaves owned by the military. Investigating this particular aspect of the legions is difficult, however, due to the ambiguity of the terms in the sources' original Latin and Greek. There are instances where slaves were called into battle, which implies they had their own weapons, so perhaps they could fit into a different category of troops described in the sources. We don't really know. Lastly, all of these beings, both soldier and beast of burden, needed to be fed, which means that food needed to be carried and constantly supplied. How much food was required, though, once again, this is where sources are unclear, and it's where scholars disagree. One of the terms that shows up in sources, notably in Polybius, is the Greek term Medinus. We don't actually have a modern equivalent to this unit, so we can't really give a figure like one soldier required a pound of wheat a day, but that's what we have to work with. So according to Polybius, an infantryman got a third of a medimnus of wheat per month, a cavalryman got 2 medimni a month, and 7 medimni of barley. Auxiliary cavalry received slightly less. The archaeology gives us a little more to work with, although admittedly not much more. Digs have uncovered evidence that the troops ate pork as one of their main meats, and we know from other animal bones that mutton also made a substantial portion of the diet. We also have evidence of beans, lentils, salt, vinegar, and sour wine, as well as beer in some northern regions. Probably the liquids were transported in barrels and amphorae, which have been found, but the barrels, because they were made of wood, are more tricky to deal with. The animals also required food while on the march. In order for the animals to be healthy and to have enough calories to sustain the marching, a combination of dry fodder, so oats for example, and green fodder, like grass or clover, needed to be consumed. The sources are pretty vague as to how much an animal would need, but some estimates give something along the lines of 4 pounds of barley a day for horses, with the requirements for other animals basically being guesswork at this point in time. However, all animals would have required hay, and this could be brought with the troops, and it could be gathered during foraging. So with all of that said, I suppose a fitting way to wrap up this video would be to say that the requirements of the Roman military while on campaign probably varied depending on when and where the army was, and due to the scarcity of the source material, we know less about this subject than we would like. It's entirely possible that the information provided in this video may change in the future. Indeed, it's likely, but until that happens, this has been a summary of what we know about the logistics of the Imperial Roman army.